Welcome to Bloombox Growing Deeper. I'm Sarah.
I'm Hannah, and we're on a mission to help you become the gardener you want to be.
Hello, gardeners. This week we're going to talk about gardening with mushrooms, which I'm guessing is not what you expected us to say. But we have Denise Wally here with us. Denise, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I worked for Nebraska Forest Service, and I retired, a year ago in January. I can't believe it's over a year now. I was a forest ecologist, and I was the operations supervisor at Prairie Pines Nature Preserve.
Which, if you're around Lincoln, you can visit on Saturdays. So go see all the good work that Denise did while she was here. It'll be wonderful. I do have something to admit off the bat, which is that I do not like mushrooms, although they're growing on me.
Nice.
Not literally. But I went on vacation with a group of friends a couple weeks ago, and we each took turns making dinner every night. And somebody made a meal with the most delicious mushrooms I've ever eaten. And then I said, how did you do that? And I couldn't get out of him what was in it. I don't know. But to be fair, it was Colorado. So you got to be careful there.
True.
But so let's talk about mushrooms. How did you get into mushrooms?
I have been interested in mushrooms since I was a little kid. I always loved to go look at mushrooms, and my mom always encouraged it. So I've always had it in the background of my life. But when I started in forestry, a wonderful woman named Suzanne Simard, who wrote Finding the Mother Tree, was doing research on trees and mycorrhizal fungus. And I happened to read something about her, and then I followed her for the rest of my career in forestry, the connection between trees and fungus and the whole ecosystem. So that's probably when I became sort of obsessed with fungus. But it was just recently. I've always been out at Prairie Pines. There's so many mushrooms that come out through the year. So I've always been taking pictures of them. But in 2021, some people started a mushroom club in Nebraska, the Nebraska Mycological Society, and I somehow found them, and we got together, and so it's become like a much greater pastime, and I am the secretary for the club and the newsletter editor for the club. So, it took a long time to culminate into a life-changing obsession. But so basically, I just finally found my mushroom people, I guess. I've been cultivating mushrooms for a decade easily. So.
Which is what we want to talk about, because I think the two most common attitudes towards mushrooms that I'm aware of is, they're growing in my garden, what do I do about them? Or people who know they love mushrooms, but they hunt wild mushrooms, and they've not grown them themselves.
Right. Yeah, and that's funny that you should mention the ones that say, ooh, they're in my garden, because when I was, with the Forest Service, anytime they would get a question about, a mushroom growing in their yard or near their trees or whatever, it would always get forwarded to me. And they're like, oh, should I pick it? Should I, what should I do? And I'm like, well, it depends. If you don't have any animals, pets that would be interested in it, and you don't have children that might possibly pick it and eat it, then just leave it. It's not doing anything. It's not hurting anything. But again, if you have children that might be curious and, want to pick it, yes, I would recommend getting rid of the mushroom and getting it out of their sight for sure.
Yeah, I've worked to encourage poking of things we don't know, not tasting of things we don't know.
Yes, that's good. That's a great thing to teach children is you can poke it, but don't
eat
it.
it.
Don't eat it.
So just before we move into like purposefully gardening with mushrooms, are any of those things that randomly pop up in our yards like good for us? Like, would we ever eat those, or are they typically things that like come in on our mulch that we don't know what they are?
I'd say typically coming in on the mulch, there is, and I even looked this up before I came, there's one yard mushroom that seems to be really prominent. It's called the green spored parasol, which is Chlorophyllum molybdites. It's also have a nickname of the vomiter. So there's a reason you don't eat that one. It won't kill you, but it'll make you empty the contents of your stomach over and over. And those grow in fairy rings. And, and they're beautiful. I actually have a huge fairy ring in my yard. Fortunately, I have a dog that has absolutely no interest in mushrooms whatsoever. She doesn't even look at it, or she kind of looks at it and goes, I don't know what that is, so I'm going on. So they're really cool. I'd say most of the ones that would just wildly be growing are not something you'd want to eat unless you know them. Though I have heard, in fact, one of my friends took me to somebody's yard who had an oak stump and there was chicken of the woods growing out of it. That's quite edible. So again, it's just you got to learn what the wild ones are before you eat it. You need to be 100% sure you know what it is.
And what is a good way to learn that? Is it to go out with other people? Is there good guidebooks?
Nebraska does not have a guidebook, but Kansas just published a guidebook, and actually think Iowa also has one that's online. So those two would be just about everything you'd find here. You should get a good guidebook, but you should also join up with people that know. Nebraska Mycological Society has a lot of very knowledgeable people. We have forays. We take people out and teach them. So, learn from multiple sources. But if you want to be 100% sure, then you need to probably have some, confirmation from somebody who knows the first few times before you say, oh, yeah, I feel pretty good about that. So
when it comes to purposefully using mushrooms in the garden, I hear two different approaches, and I'm curious if either of you have heard any more. But there's people using mushrooms and usually it seems to be ground up in a powder or mixed into a compost to improve the soil, or growing them to harvest for food.
I've heard of both.
I've heard of neither. So this is new information to me.
Right. I mean, just cultivating them, purposefully cultivating them is going to improve the soil. But, there are special potting mixes, like Bob Hendrickson uses a potting mix that's got a mycorrhizal component, which is fungi that supposedly forms a symbiosis with the plants or trees or whatever. So you can do that. But to me, it's well, why not grow something you could eat while improving the soil? So,
right, because not all mycorrhizal are mushrooms. How does it work?
Mycorrhizal is mushrooms.
Okay.
Yes, those are fungi that, so myco means mushroom fungus, and rhizal means root.
Oh, okay.
So what they do is they form a symbiotic relationship with the roots of plants and trees. And what they do is they help those plants and trees, mostly trees, get nutrients and water, and actually increases their root surface area by 100-fold. And so the fungus gets nutrients and sugar from the tree, and the tree gets nutrients and water from the fungus and more surface area. So it's a beautiful symbiotic relationship.
But not all mushrooms are mycorrhizal?
No, not all mushrooms are mycorrhizal.
Okay, I'm figuring it out.
Right. So there's saprophytic, which means that they break down organic matter instead of forming these symbiotic relationships. Now, I'm not sure if we know that saprophytic don't form some sort of bond, but in general, their purpose is to break down organic matter. Wood material, sawdust, mulch, any organic matter, really.
So I'm going to just back up and recap that. So mycorrhizal mushrooms grow in the root zone of a plant and form a symbiotic relationship. And sometimes when you pull up tree roots, and there's all this white hair on them.
Yep.
That's the mycorrhizal mushrooms, not the roots. It's kind of them on the roots.
Let's
Go
call
ahead.
them mycorrhizal fungi.
Okay.
Because mushrooms are actually the fruiting bodies of the fungus, like an apple on a tree.
Oh.
That's what a mushroom is. It's the
Okay.
reproductive fruit of fungus. I know.
That makes sense. Okay,
It's
so
a lot.
that's why then Hannah pictured, well, it can't be a mushroom underground because it doesn't look like a mushroom.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Technically it's not a mushroom underground. It's fungus. It's a fungi. Right. The mycelium, which is the
Yes.
actual body, the main body of the
And
of
it pops
fungi.
the mushroom up above
Yes.
ground to fruit.
For the
and
most
reproduce.
part, yes. I mean,
Okay.
there's few exceptions, like truffles don't tend to expose themselves too much, but they're right at the surface.
Okay.
And there's some others that do some weird stuff. But yeah, for the most part, the mushroom goes above the surface of the ground because its job is to send spores into the world to reproduce.
That makes sense.
Yep.
That's one of the creepiest things I've ever heard.
Yes, it is. But here's a creepier fact: is mushrooms are more closely related to animals than they are to plants.
Sure, I
So-
can see that. Probably why I'm freaked out too, and our podcast listeners know this. I'm an avid sci-fi reader, and
Yes.
I've read a few sci-fi where mushroom type creatures take over.
Last of Us. That's the
haven't
new,
done that one yet,
Oh
but
my
yeah.
gosh, that's cordyceps, which it cannot happen. That is a fiction. It cannot do that to a human being, but it does do it to insects. They do take over the mind, the brains, and nerves of insects. So
We did mention to a colleague in the hallway that we were going to record on mushrooms, and she was hoping it was a very different kind of mushrooms than we're actually talking about. So
yes,
we are talking about mushrooms for their nutritional value.
right.
Not zombie mushrooms.
No, we're not talking about zombie mushrooms. Zombie mushrooms do not exist for human beings yet.
I was going to say, yeah.
Yet.
On this planet.
On this planet, that's
They're
right.
coming.
Who knows? Hey, fungus are very interesting organisms. On another planet, they might be the dominant life form. You never know. They were a dominant life form before humans were.
Yeah.
Here.
They're very cool.
We're digressing. Though.
We are. I'm here to pull you
But
back
it
on
is
topic.
interesting. It is interesting. But yes, let's go back to gardening.
Okay. So the saprophytic, did I
Okay.
get that word right?
Yes, saprophytic.
That then is the fungi category that we're more interested for producing food.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
For the most part, most of the cultivated mushrooms are saprophytic because it's just easier to cultivate something that is going to break down the organic matter that you provide it rather than having to establish a symbiotic relationship between it and a plant or a tree and then wait for the conditions to be perfect. Like morels are mycorrhizal, which is why they are so elusive. There are people trying to cultivate them. They're not having huge success, but you never know what'll happen in the future. But yes, let's talk about those that
Okay.
we can cook
That
to,
we
we
can
can
cook
eat,
to
we
eat.
can grow them to eat them, to make medicines, whatever.
So generally speaking, I mean like big, broad, what makes a happy garden for a mushroom?
Lots of organic matter, shade. They do not like direct sun, but they don't need the dark either. That's a misnomer about mushrooms, that there's only like one specific species that grows in the dark and the rest need lights and moisture. They do not like dry conditions. They don't like it. They don't necessarily like it sopping wet either, but you do have to make sure they stay hydrated.
And you hosted a spot on the garden walk last fall.
Yes, I did.
And it was clear to see how you've created the perfect mushroom garden with you've got trees, generally shading it, but I could tell from the plants you planted, you're still getting dappled light coming through those trees. And you've got an understory of larger perennials and some shrubs.
Yep.
And it just made me think of a woodland setting that you've created in your yard.
Yeah, and that's kind of the hope. At least where we have the only street tree on the block, and it's a huge red oak, and so there's very little sun on that part of our garden. So it is. That's exactly what I've done, is reproduced a woodland understory garden. But even in the areas where there's partial sun, I still can grow mushrooms like underneath plants that will get tall and give them shade. And then in the back, which you didn't get to see on the garden tour, where I grow my tomatoes and peppers and whatever, I grow the mushrooms underneath them, because those plants get really big. And by the time the heat and the sun are intense enough, those plants are big enough to shade them. And anytime we get a little rain, I just get a little bit of a flush of mushrooms coming out, so I could go pick a tomato and pick some golden oysters. So yeah, it's very easy.
Okay, so you mentioned a couple, but what are the types of mushrooms that we could grow at least in this part of Nebraska, in our gardens?
Yeah, there's a wide variety of things we could grow. Oysters, there's at least 4 or 5 different colors. I'll say colors of oysters, but some of them are different species or different strains. There's shiitake, which is not native to here, but I don't think we're in jeopardy of it becoming rogue or anything, or invasive. Lion's mane, let's see, maitake, which is hen of the woods, Laetoporus, which is chicken of the woods. I mean, just about any really ones that are saprophytic that you might find in the wild, you could probably cultivate as well.
That makes sense. So, because it seems like from looking at your garden and hearing what you say, these aren't conditions that it's difficult to create in an urban area. No. We tend toward soils that are clayey and moisture filled.
Right.
Maybe just like the organic matter, we need to make sure we're keeping high.
Yeah.
Some of our urban sites, our home gardens can be a little low on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, all you have to really do is add mulch or compost, depending on what the species are.
Yeah. I'm anticipating a question about Western Nebraska.
Okay.
And I'm just thinking about it. I mean, if I think about Western Nebraska woodlands, there's got to be fungi in there.
Oh, I'm sure there is.
Do you see a possibility for people out west to be able to create this? Or is I'm wondering about humidity wise, because we can keep a garden moist.
Right.
But yes, their
air humidity does make a difference. But there are, as far as cultivated ones, at least the ones I've grown, they really do need a specific amount of atmospheric humidity. But of course, there are some native ones there that would grow now, not necessarily edible, but they would definitely grow. I think it'll be a challenge anywhere that's dry. It's not a xeriscape plant or organism, it's yeah, I mean, but you get water out there, and some of them have adapted to, like, okay, you get a rainstorm and the next day a whole bunch of mushrooms pop out, because that's their window of opportunity to grow fast, and they do grow really fast, and put their spores out and move on. So yeah, it would be a challenge in the West, but I'm not going to say it's impossible. I mean, try it. It's worth trying.
So what are your favorites to grow?
I have such a long list of favorites to grow, it's not even funny. I have tried just about everything that's available through, companies that make the mycelium blocks. So my favorites, oysters, are so easy. I mean, they're easy, and they pop up and they keep popping up. So I really like them. I'm trying hen of the woods, which is maitake, Grifola frondosa. It has not fruited yet, but it's only been in since last summer. So, and it's in a log, and that takes a little extra effort. So like things like shiitakes, those need logs. Actually, they prefer the wood in order to the mycelium breaks down the wood, and then the fruit comes out when it's ready. But there's plenty, like oysters don't necessarily need wood. Lion's mane, which is a really, really weird, interesting looking puffball not a puffball, but it's got these little hairs that looks like a mane. And they're such a bizarre looking mushroom, and they're incredibly tasty, and there's scientific research that shows that they help with brain function. I've grown reishi in inside. I have not grown that in outdoors yet, but we had to take a maple tree down last year because it was on its last legs, and the squirrels were basically girdling every single thing. So we took it down, but I left a huge stump, and this spring I'm going to plug that stump with mushroom plugs. And I would encourage anybody that cuts down a tree, don't cut it to the very base. Leave yourself a stump and grow mushrooms out of it, because a stump will give mushrooms like multiple years of fruiting, like especially with shiitake. So
what a great way to use our urban wood.
Yes, it is a great way to use urban wood instead of cutting it down. Leave yourself a big stump and use it to grow mushrooms.
I think that sounds very fun. You started to talk about, so my next question for you was, have you done growing mushrooms inside?
Yes, I've been growing mushrooms inside for at least a decade. I have a little grow chamber. It's just, one of those plastic little greenhouse things with shelves, and you just put a humidifier in there, and you have to have some air exchange. And I buy the mycelium blocks, and I put them in there and make sure the humidity stays high, and hit fruits, and I harvest it and eat it.
Cool. I'm wondering, maybe, if you live in a drier climate, that might be the easiest way to do it.
Absolutely. That's definitely an alternative.
Was that like entrance for you because it was easier, or entrance because you didn't have your yard ready?
I really hadn't even thought about growing mushrooms in the landscape at that point. And that's really just like the last couple of years. And I attended a webinar or something that talked about, and I was like, mushrooms in the garden, that's brilliant. Of course. Why didn't I think of that? It's like somebody has a great idea and you wonder why you didn't think of that. Well, I just didn't. But now that I have, I hope to pass it on to other people. But yeah, it's so easy. It had never occurred to me, which I just can't believe it didn't.
I mean, I don't know until that day we were potting together in the greenhouse if it had ever occurred to me that, like, I knew people grew mushrooms in their basements, like in grow chambers. Mm-hmm. And I knew we had fungi in the garden because otherwise we wouldn't have decomposition.
Yeah.
But I never connected the two, that you could, then that meant you could also grow mushrooms in the garden to eat.
Yeah, and I had that same moment too. So it was like, I put mulch in the garden, and why couldn't I grow them underneath vegetables and plants, and why not? So yeah, it's wonderful.
Can you kind of walk us through step by step how somebody would get started with growing mushrooms in their garden?
Sure.
And you pick whichever kind you want.
Okay, I'm going to go with oysters because they're the easiest. Now, some people create their own mycelium block, and you can do that too, but it takes some time and not really even specialized equipment, but it just takes time and the spores. You have to have the spawn for it. So what I do is I buy the mycelium blocks from a regional place because there used to be a mushroom grower here in Grand Island, but he is no longer in business, and he's pursuing other studies in fungus, of course. So Field and Forest Products in Wisconsin is where I buy almost all of mine. Occasionally I'll buy something from somewhere else if they don't have what I'm looking for, but I'd like to have the regional, at least a regional. I mean, I'd love it if somebody in Nebraska was doing that, but anyway, so you buy your mycelium block, which means it's going to be some sort of sawdust or grain or whatever that they have inoculated with the fungus, and the mycelium has taken over the whole thing. And by the time it gets to you, it's ready to go to the next step, which is the fruiting step. So in order you take your mycelium block and you find places in your garden. You don't have to put the whole block in one place. You can actually cut it I usually cut it into fourths or sixths or something. You want enough mycelium in it to give it a good start, but it doesn't have to be the whole block. And I just dig a little spot in the soil, move the mulch away, dig just a little bitty trench. You don't want it. You want the mycelium to get up just a little bit above the soil line, and then kind of pack it in there and then cover it with mulch. And you want at least 2-3 inches of mulch on top of it. And keep an eye on the squirrels because they love to move the mulch off of it. So you just go back and you just put it on there.
They're pretty convinced you put an acorn in there.
Yes. Well, and actually some squirrels do like fungus. So you just cover it with mulch and make sure that it stays moist. And then you just wait for the conditions. I mean, the conditions will be right when it's right, and then you'll see the mushrooms start popping up, and then you just harvest them, and it'll continue to do that for as long as you've got mulch and the mycelium's alive.
So you said you put them among your vegetables gardens sometimes. So does that mean you water it at the same rate as vegetables, or it gets water from around? Yeah,
pretty much I water it. If the vegetables need water, if the plants that are fruiting for eating need water, they need water. So it's about the same. They don't necessarily need more than the plants around them.
That's an easier way to think about it. Yeah, because you know when to water your tomatoes. Right. So there you go.
Yeah.
All right. Sounds good. So then how long does it take after you do that to where you get to harvest them?
Well, I wish I could say there was in 2 days you're going to have them, but it's going to depend on the conditions. If the conditions are right and they fruit, then as soon as they're big enough to be, you can see them, you might let them go another day, then you harvest them. The thing that you want to watch, if you're not going to eat them, it's okay to just let them grow and sporulate. But if you're going to eat them, you want to get them before they're ready to drop their spores, because it's just not good to eat a lot of spores. I mean, for some species, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. But they're a lot more tender, and they taste better when they haven't spored yet.
I just love the language with this.
I know.
Spores and spawning.
It's great because it's
inoculate.
Now you know why there's so much science fiction that lends itself to fungus, because the language itself sounds so alien.
Just thinking about eating spores, it's just creeping me out. I can't handle it.
Well, I try not to. I try to let the spores go back into the environment and do their thing. But
if they do, what did you call it? Sporulate?
Sporulate. Okay. That's cool. When they release their spores.
Yeah.
Isn't that a great word, though?
I love that word.
Sporulate.
We're going to have to put that for our Wednesday word.
Oh, I've got a better word for you, though. There's a species called inky cap, and the way it dispenses its spores, I'll say, is deliquescing, which means it basically liquefies, kind of like a zombie melting. That's kind of what it reminds you of. It liquefies, deliquescing. It's great. That's one of my favorite words.
Okay, that one you don't eat, or you do?
Some people eat inky caps when they're
I'm sure they do.
Very young and not even really close to deliquescing, because it's nasty. But when they deliquesce, you can take that spore, it's black. You can actually make ink out of it. I have a picture, a drawing of an ink cap drawn with the ink from the deliquescing ink cap.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was a lady in England, and when I saw that, I was like, I have to have that. That's just so cool.
So if it does sporulate, but it won't hurt it, it'll keep producing after that. It's
absolutely
not like letting dill go to seed.
No. Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's up to you. Once it's spored, if you want to cut it and throw it somewhere else in the garden, fine. I mean, or just leave it. It'll fruit around it.
So if somebody listened to this podcast and got very excited about gardening with mushrooms, is there a common error you see that you would want to make sure that people were prepared for? Is there something if someone's going to do something wrong, is there like a typical error to make?
That's a good question. I don't know too many people that are gardening with mushrooms. In fact, I know one, and that's me.
Well, we're hoping to change that.
I mean, obviously, I went to a seminar or webinar, and people are doing it in other places, but I've never actually talked to anybody here that is. But I'd say for growing mushrooms itself, probably the biggest error is not enough humidity, and surprisingly not enough light. Because a lot of those fungi are light is what triggers them to send the pins. They're called pins when they're little things out. So they need enough humidity, they need light, and they need some fresh air too. So.
Which brings me to another question. Do they make it through the winter, or do you have to start this process over every year?
No, they just stay out. I mean, just like native natural fungus in the environment, they go dormant, and, some of them, the mycelium may not come back. And then again, maybe they will. I've noticed I have a little oyster cluster that's right by my front walk. Let's see, it fruited just before the garden tour, and then we had some warm days, I think in either December, and it fruited. And then it froze, so those fruit are not good to eat, but it's still there. And then I noticed this morning it looks like a little, like on the side of the old one, there's a little bit starting to come up again. So yeah, I mean, they'll just go dormant, and if they survive, they survive. If they don't, then you just replant.
Cool. I mean, that's kind of how most gardening goes.
Exactly. I mean,
even if it's supposed to survive, it's not guaranteed.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So we tried to plan the release of this episode around a decent time to do stuff. So it's early May. Mm-hmm. Is there kind of like a planting season, or do you just avoid like the hottest part of the year?
I don't avoid anything. I was done with some mycelium blocks last year in July. And I said, okay, I'm going to cut them up and put them in the garden. Didn't make any difference. You obviously can't do it when it's frozen. You don't want to do that. But
fair enough.
But, as soon as, it starts to get warm, like now, or even depending on where you are in Nebraska, probably March, April, you can start putting it in there. The warmer the ground is, the faster the mycelium will, explore and expand. So if you want to wait a little bit, you might get faster results. But I mean, it'll start growing when it needs to grow. As long as the ground is diggable, you can put it in there, and you might have to wait a little longer, but it's okay. So yeah, you can do it any time.
Have you had any problems with it taking over?
No.
That's good. Okay.
No.
Anna's very worried about being invaded by mushrooms.
Yes, I understand that. Well, the availability of an organic material to break down is its limiting factor. That's why if you keep it for multiple years, you're going to have to keep adding mulch. And I want to say something about mulch too, because mulch does make a difference. They do prefer hardwood mulch, but you can use conifer mulch. You just may not get as robust of a fruiting. Like, we're losing a lot of ash trees, and there's a lot of ash chips. That's a fantastic mulch to use. Oak would be even better. So yeah, the hardwoods. To foresters, it's deciduous and coniferous. But anyway, what you would call hardwoods.
To
yes.
my carpenter husband, there's also softwood.
Yes.
And hardwood, and then conifer.
Yeah, there's soft hardwood, soft deciduous, there's hard deciduous, there's soft conifers, and there's hard conifers. Yes.
But we're talking about deciduous trees.
We're talking about deciduous trees, oaks, maples, whatever.
Do you have to worry? Sometimes if you buy mulch in the bag from the store, it's already got some fungi growing in there.
Yes.
Is that bad?
It's not bad, but depending on what you're trying to grow, it could be detrimental. So oysters are pretty vigorous, and they outcompete other fungus fairly easily. Things like chicken of the woods and hen of the woods. When you are inoculating your logs, you're actually supposed to sterilize them completely because they don't do well with competition from native fungus around. So it really just depends on, which you're growing. But for the most part, I think, unless sometimes you'll get a mulch and you can even see the mycelium in there. Mm-hmm. That's probably not the best because you want to give what you're trying to grow for food the most opportunity. And if it has to compete against another fungus, then it may not be as vigorous.
So if you have the chance, if a tree is coming down or a neighbor's tree is coming down or some towns make their city mulch available where it's never been bagged and it's probably been shipped pretty recently. Yeah. That'd be ideal.
That's ideal.
Okay.
Yeah, that's perfect. And in fact, I would encourage people to find those sources of mulch because, do your local stuff because it's also going to be, it's just going to be better for growing it.
So can you talk a little bit about the log inoculate? Like, how does it work to grow it on logs? Because that sounds really cool.
It is really cool. It's very labor intensive. There's a whole diagram of what species will grow what species of fungus. Field and Forest Products has a whole diagram there. It gives you, the best species and then marginal and then probably don't try it. I have to say, a little bit of a side note is they put hackberry on there as growing several things, and at Prairie Pines we have lots of hackberry. So I used hackberry for a lot of things. Just take my word for it, it's not that great. So like shiitake. Shiitake is probably to me it's one of the best tasting cooked mushrooms there is. It's just so yummy. But they like the harder, denser woods, so like oaks and hard maples like sugar maples, and a few others. Those are the best species. And then oysters like the softer woods like willow and cottonwood. They don't like the denser. It's harder for them to colonize the denser. So, yeah, you just have to pair your fungi and your log species together. But what it is they grow the mycelium on little wooden dowels, and you go through and you drill holes in it about every inch, and you plug those in and you cover it with wax, and then you prop up your log somewhere and let it do its thing, let the mycelium take over, and in a couple. Yeah, if you're lucky, a year and a half, you'll get your first flush. I think we got a flush of shiitake out at Prairie Pines like half a year. So I don't know, must have been in a good place. But some others, take longer. But that thing will, if it's especially for the shiitake because you're in a denser wood, it will fruit for like 7 years. So. Yeah, it's worth it.
That's not very different investment than a fruit tree.
Yeah,
a couple of years to get fruit and then a decade or so of harvesting.
Yeah, exactly. So it's definitely worth it. And they're yummy.
Let's add colonize to the list of creepy words.
Oh, yes, colonize. Well, I'm sorry I have to say that this type of colonization is not quite the same as... our social human colonization.
Right. Anyways, yeah. Okay. Well, mushrooms. I'm coming around.
Yes.
I was just thinking maybe I'll plant a few.
Okay.
Plant, I guess.
And you don't have to
really
eat them.
Planting.
They're just really interesting to grow too.
I do wonder, does it improve your plants?
I think it does. Yeah. Okay. So last year was the first time I had put them under tomatoes and peppers. Mm-hmm. And I have never seen tomatoes and peppers grow so robustly. I could not keep up with them, and I was trimming them back, and I still couldn't keep up with them. And then I'd get a flush of mushrooms too. So I am convinced that, even though those aren't mycorrhizal species, that them breaking down the organic matter in the root zones of those plants is still making nutrients available to the plants that it would not have gotten otherwise. So it can't hurt it.
Maybe I need to add another layer to my over-intensively farmed vegetable garden.
Maybe.
I have a very tight space we put our vegetables, and I layer them all. We've got peppers, and then there's parsley, and then there's carrots in front of that. Maybe we need some mushrooms.
Yeah.
We'll have a whole salad.
Yeah, exactly. And you can grow them all together.
Okay, so that day in the greenhouse that got me hooked on your mushrooms, you were talking about studying ethnomycology.
Yes, ethnomycology.
Yes, I had to Google that before you came. I did not just remember that word.
What is that?
What is that? Yeah. Hannah helped because I was like, what is the opposite of ethnobotany? And she was like, mycology.
So it is related to ethnobotany. Ethno is humans, and ethnicity actually, but we'll say humans. And then mycology is the study of mushrooms. So it is the relationship between humans and mushrooms, because while America is becoming more mycophilic, yes, I'm throwing all these great words. It has been mycophobic for a long time. So mycophobia is the fear of mushrooms. And this stems from a lot of different things. There's cultures all over the world that are hugely mycophilic, and then there's a lot of cultures that are mycophobic too. What was my point? So we're becoming more mycophilic. But so this is the relationship: do you fear mushrooms or do you embrace mushrooms? And obviously, there's some cultures that...
Are you Denise or are you Hannah?
And a lot of people are afraid of them. And there are good reasons to be afraid of some mushrooms. There are mushrooms that will kill you.
Right. I was wondering if the cultural correlation is there's more mushrooms in your environment that can harm you than good. Are those the cultures that tend to be more...
That's an
phobic?
Interesting thought, and I really hadn't thought about it, and I don't think so. I don't think there's that direct of a correlation, because there's actually mushrooms, fungus in every ecosystem, even the desert. There are truffles that grow in the desert. There are puffballs that grow in the prairie. So there's mushrooms available in just about every ecosystem. So I don't know. That's an interesting question. I might have to ask some of my ethnomycology friends about if they've noticed a correlation.
I was also wondering if it has to do with the length of time people have been in a place, because it seems like because mushrooms have so much potential to be either really yummy or deadly, that if you move to a new place, you'd be slower to try the mushrooms than other things.
I think that's a fair thing to say. Indigenous people all over the world understand which ones are deadly and which ones aren't, and most of those cultures, they either know that we stay away or we embrace them. Some are used for medicine, some are used for food. But even in places where there are people that have been there for a long time, there's still, I would still say that there are cultures that aren't as, predisposed or whatever to use mushrooms. And then there's some that use them all the time as medicine, as whatever.
So what do you think is driving, because you said the U.S. is moving more into an appreciation of mushrooms, and I have seen the mushroom coffee and the mushrooms seem to be in everything.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. I'm happy that more people are figuring this out. I might say Paul Stamets is what happened from Fungi Perfecti. He's done so much research on medicinal and benefits of mushrooms, fungi, and I think he's been doing this for a long time, and I think it finally got some steam. And he's not the only one, but he's one of the forerunners. And then a few years ago, there was a movie that came out, Fantastic Fungi. Some people saw that, and I think it could be one of the reasons people were like, "Oh my gosh, that's really cool."
I did not see it.
You need to see it. It's really cool.
I probably should.
It's really neat. It shows slow motion growth of mushrooms, and it's really good.
I think people also got really excited about things they could grow in containers in their houses.
Yeah.
And because that's how, I mean, even before we'd talked, I'd seen things all over like Pinterest and social media about growing mushrooms in a tub or growing mushrooms in a laundry basket.
Yeah.
And I think especially, urban areas that don't have the access to gardening, they got very excited with all these grow towers and grow on your counter and grow light setups that they could, use in an apartment.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think that has added to the growing interest. But I mean, there was still somewhere. I mean, like I always say, I liked mushrooms before it was cool to like mushrooms. And I was growing mushrooms like 10 years ago. Not that makes me any better. It just, I've been aware of them. But there's also this cultural bias against mushrooms because of lack of knowledge. Like you said, if people have moved from where they lived before and they've come to a new place, then they don't know that much about mushrooms. And, so you get this, like I call it the toadstool phenomenon. Toadstool is a colloquial term, is not a scientific term, but it's often refers to mushrooms that are not edible. But a lot of people just call them all toadstools because if you don't know, then you shouldn't eat it. So I think there's that fear of not knowing if it's edible or it's going to kill you, because there are ones here that could kill you.
And I bet it is tied to just that if you aren't using them regularly, like I can't think of many recipes, for instance, that my family makes or made when I was a kid that included mushrooms.
Yeah.
So it was just not something that I was used to. And then if I did see some, I don't know what world you were in, Sarah, because I didn't see anywhere anything about growing mushrooms. We were in two separate places. If I had seen that, I would have been like, why? What are we doing here?
Yeah.
So, but that does bring us to, so what do you like to do with your mushrooms?
Oh, well, I like to eat them. And again, it depends on what kind of, what mushroom I'm talking about. I do make tinctures out of turkey tail and reishi because they're both medicinal and they have some great properties. For the most part, I make this really killer Hungarian mushroom soup. Oh my gosh, it's so good. And I just throw any kind of mushroom in there. But I particularly like shiitake and maitake. Those are probably my two favorites as far as taste and texture. And I do like to throw a bunch of different ones in the Hungarian mushroom soup because you do get different textures, different mushrooms. Some you can cook them and cook them and cook them and they never get soft. And some you don't have to cook them very long and they get soft and they're nice and buttery and texture-wise. And so, it's they're all different. And I've made crab cakes with lion's mane instead of crab because lion's mane kind of has the crabbish taste. It's a little on the sweeter side, and it has a similar texture. And I couldn't tell it wasn't crab. There's entire cookbooks dedicated to it. So
something that slowed me down using mushrooms, and I wonder if this is true for other people too, is getting them is not always easy. Usually, if you just go to your generic grocery store, you have one or two kinds. Mm-hmm. I did find Costco every once in a while has this like chef's collection.
The chef's
of
collection,
mushrooms,
yes.
which is so cool.
It is.
But then they only last so long in your fridge.
That's right.
Canned mushrooms only belong on pizza from the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
Nowhere else. And you introduced me to dried mushrooms that you can rehydrate them.
Absolutely.
And so I brought some show and tell.
Oh, good. Yes. So if you ever have an excess of, oh my gosh, that's wonderful.
Okay, so this is how the latest movie starts: is Sarah in a podcast being like, "Here's some dried mushrooms.
Yeah.
And now you're all gonna die."
It tells me a few things. So this is just a giant bit of dried mushrooms that
Yeah.
are clearly all different kinds.
Right.
And it doesn't tell me a lot.
No.
It's the Wild Mushroom Company, which sort of weirds me out.
Okay.
It does tell us that supposedly it's yellow boletus,
Okay.
portobello, oyster mushrooms, and porcini.
Okay.
But I don't know. And
Yeah.
they're dry.
I mean,
so how are we gonna
I'm
figure it
looking
out?
at it and I can recognize some of them,
Some
even
of
in the
them.
dried state. I'm guessing that the porcini content is really low because
that a
porcini
fancy one?
that is the king bolete. That is like prized gourmet fungus mushroom in Europe and here too.
Yeah.
In places here. So, yeah, just the fact that you don't really know what's in it. That's,
or where they came from. It tells me they were packed in France, but
Yeah.
it doesn't tell me where they grew.
Yeah, probably in China, because even Europe now has to get a lot of their gourmet mushrooms elsewhere because
Yeah.
they've outstripped the ability to supply their population with, wild picked porcinis or whatever.
They're not from Chernobyl.
Honestly, there is a fungus growing inside of Chernobyl that is likes the radiation. That's not one you'd ever eat.
And you guys keep telling me mushrooms are normal. Like, what?
They are
is that?
normal. They were here way before we were.
So, yeah, I grabbed this partly because I figured you were
Right.
going to have an opinion about it, but also because that if you can get good dried mushrooms, that would make them a lot more accessible. And that was
Absolutely.
the first time I saw them in a regular grocery store.
Yeah, I don't see them much in a regular grocery store, though. I have to say Hy-Vee is sometimes has a few more, like they have lion's mane and blue oyster sometimes, and a shiitake occasionally. So that's good. It's becoming more popular. But there are places you can order dried edible mushrooms from that are reputable. In fact, I wanted to mention one. Far West Fungi is a place in California. Well, there is a mushroom that grows in California. It's called the candy cap. It does not grow here. But I don't know how far. I know it's in California. It may be up into Oregon or Washington, but I'm not quite sure. But it smells like maple. It is the only mushroom I have seen that is used for dessert. And I have used it in sugar cookies, and people would swear I had put maple syrup in it when it was just the candy cap mushroom in it.
Sounds awesome.
It smells. I wish I should have brought a sample so you could smell. It just is. It's amazing that there's so much diversity even in the mushrooms.
So if you get dried mushrooms, you just rehydrate them and then cook
Yes.
how you normally would.
Yeah. And, you can be adventurous with your rehydration, too. You don't have to use water. You can use alcohol. You can use a stock, beef stock, chicken stock, vegetable stock. You can use brandy. You can use rum, whatever, as long as it's a liquid.
I think the ones you gave me, I rehydrated in red wine and then put in a beef stew that had a red wine broth. They were
amazing.
very good. But I've also had good luck just putting them dry straight in my Instant Pot and just adding like a couple teaspoons more water.
Oh, yeah.
And they just rehydrate with the rice.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
that works really well.
Yep. It's a good way to do it.
I brought another show and tell.
Oh, I see.
So the easier way I found to get mushrooms is unami powder.
Yes.
Because then you a little bit more. There's brands made
Yes.
around
Yeah.
unami powder. But I took this and I mixed it with some spices and I called it my unagi unami powder.
I love it.
It's a little shout out to friends because
Yes.
I was trying to say the word over and over and it was coming out wrong.
That's funny. Yeah, actually, I have some mushroom salt. So it's you know, unami. Who knows what species it is, but you know, it's in with the salt.
Yeah, they didn't tell me. They just said unami powder made with mushrooms.
Yep, made with mushrooms.
Of a generic variety.
Yes, it's probably just button mushrooms, which is Agaricus bisporus. And by the way, in case you wanted to know, that portobello, baby bella, crimini, and buttons are all the same species. They're just grown a little different conditions, and somebody got brilliant and marketed them so they could charge more for the bellas. And yeah, those are all Agaricus bisporus. So if somebody says, oh, well, I don't like baby bellas, but I love buttons, I'm like, you're eating the same species. Now, portobellas are a little bit more mature, and I can understand because they get a little bit more meatier. But yeah, so if somebody tries to tell you, oh, it's different, it's like, no, it's not different. Sorry.
I mean, it's the same with green peppers and
Yeah.
red and yellow and orange peppers.
Yeah, it's kind of that way.
But a lot of people don't realize the green peppers are just immature.
Immature.
And if you left them on the plant, they would be red,
Yeah.
yellow, or orange.
Which is what I do because I don't like the green.
I don't either.
It's too bitter. I like the sweet, but anyway.
All right. Well, thank you so much for talking to us all about mushrooms. This was fascinating and only scary sometimes.
Only scary when you're watching Last of Us.
That's right.
But just keep telling yourself it can't happen to humans.
Which is why I don't watch it.
Yeah, but it is very interesting. Actually, the artwork that, you know, I think they're called the clickers. I've not watched it. I can't watch horror.
Yeah, neither can I.
But the makeup and the prosthetics that they use for that are just absolutely beautiful. And I actually read an article that they had to combine a bunch of different species. It's not really cordyceps because cordyceps doesn't have that variety, but they mixed it with like chicken of the woods and a few others just to get the beautiful colors and, you know, different textures of it. And I was like, oh, that's really cool. But I mean, it gets people thinking about fungi and mushrooms.
Right.
So
Yeah, I like it.
yeah.
Well, cool. Okay, well, it's time to do our plant of the week, which we are changing a little bit so that you can do organism of the week.
Organism of the week.
We'll do it that way.
Okay.
So, would you like to go first?
Sure. My organism of the week will be oyster mushrooms. I highly recommend if you've never grown anything indoors or outdoors, start with oysters. They're super easy. They're not picky, and they will continue to fruit for you again and again. So that's my pick.
Okay, Hannah, what's your plant of the week or what's blooming? Which one did you want to do?
I will do what's blooming because I think I do this we're a year into the podcast now. And so I think I did it at the same time last year because it's my favorite, and that is catalpa trees. They would be blooming and they're gorgeous. And this is the best time because I think catalpas are always identifiable because they're just so unique of a tree. But often I find when I talk about catalpas, I can say, and they're blooming right now, the big white flowers. And then everyone knows, oh yeah, I have one on the bike path or on, my drive home or whatever it is. So I love catalpas. I'm sure I will put some pictures in the show notes. And
I love catalpas too.
Yeah.
They're beautiful when they're blooming.
They're beautiful when they're blooming. I love the leaves. I love the seed pods. And I think they are the perfect Halloween tree.
They are. They remind me of hobbit trees. I've always said they belong in Hobbitville.
They do.
Because they've got such a unique characteristic of the way they grow. Almost looks like an int.
I bet they would also make good wands.
I bet they would.
Yeah.
Very powerful magic there.
Yes. All right, Sarah, how about you?
Okay, I'm also going to do what's blooming, but also what survived. And that's my prairie smoke, which I think we've talked about a little bit. It's like very ferny leaves that grow lowish to the ground, but then the flowers look like pink troll hair. And you might look at them and think it's the seed, but it's actually the flower. And they're notoriously hard to establish because they don't like being wet in the winter. And a lot of our landscapes tend to be where we pile our snow. So I have successfully survived winter with some prairie smoke, and I'm very happy about it.
I'm never going to look at it the same again. Now I'm going to see the little trolls, the trolls of the 70s. Oh, I'm going to see their hair now. That's a great comparison.
Well, thank you again for coming. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And everyone, don't forget to send us in your questions, because we are going to be doing a question and answer episode very, very, very soon. And we're in the heart of gardening season now. So it is time to send those in, and we will do our best to answer them. And if we don't know how to answer them, we'll send it to somebody else and we'll find an answer for you. We'll get one. There will be an answer. So don't forget to rate and review us. Send in your questions. And Bloombox and Bloombox Growing Deeper are both programs of the Nebraska Statewide Arboretum.